I never thought I'd discover that my first date was being broadcast to thousands of strangers on the internet, complete with running commentary about my appearance, personality, and every intimate detail I shared, thinking I was having a private conversation. But that's exactly what happened when I agreed to meet someone who turned our supposedly romantic evening into content for his twisted online audience that was voting on everything from what I should order to whether I deserved a second date. The whole nightmare began when I matched with someone named Ryan on a popular dating app. His profile seemed perfect, attractive but not intimidatingly so, funny bio that showed genuine personality, photos that suggested he was social and well-adjusted. After months of disappointing matches and conversations that went nowhere, Ryan felt like a breath of fresh air. Our initial messages were engaging and flirtatious in all the right ways. Ryan asked thoughtful questions about my interests, remembered details from previous conversations, and had a way of making me laugh even through text. He seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person rather than just trying to get me into bed, which had become depressingly rare in my online dating experience. When Ryan suggested we meet for dinner at a trendy new restaurant downtown, I was genuinely excited. He'd clearly put thought into choosing a place that matched my tastes. I'd mentioned loving fusion cuisine in my profile, and the restaurant he suggested had been getting great reviews for exactly that type of food. It felt like he was actually listening to what I'd told him about myself. I spent way too long getting ready for our date, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a dress that struck the right balance between attractive and not trying too hard. As I walked to the restaurant, I felt that flutter of possibility that comes with meeting someone who might actually turn out to be worth my time and energy. Ryan was already seated when I arrived, and he looked exactly like his photos. Tall, dark-haired, with an easy smile that made me feel instantly comfortable. He stood up to greet me with a brief hug and complimented my dress in a way that felt genuine rather than performative. As the hostess led us to our table, I found myself thinking that maybe this would finally be a normal, pleasant first date. The conversation over dinner flowed naturally, covering all the typical first date topics: work, family, hobbies, travel experiences. Ryan was attentive and engaging, asking follow-up questions that showed he was actually listening to my answers. He shared funny stories about his job in marketing and seemed genuinely interested when I talked about my work as a teacher. But about halfway through the meal, I started noticing things that felt slightly off. Ryan would occasionally glance at his phone, which was positioned on the table in a way that seemed deliberately angled toward me. When I mentioned this seemed rude, he apologized and explained that he was expecting an important work call, but he kept the phone in the same position. I also noticed that Ryan's conversation topics seemed almost scripted, like he was following a predetermined list of questions designed to get specific types of responses from me. When I shared personal stories or opinions, he'd nod enthusiastically and make comments that felt less like natural reactions and more like he was performing for an audience I couldn't see. The most unsettling moment came when Ryan excused himself to go to the bathroom, leaving his phone on the table. The screen was still lit up, and I could see what looked like a live chat feed with hundreds of messages scrolling by rapidly. Before I could process what I was seeing, Ryan returned and quickly pocketed the phone, but not before I caught a glimpse of usernames and comments that seemed to be discussing our date in real time. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual while my mind raced with questions about what I'd just seen. "Of course," Ryan said, his smile never wavering. "Just some work stuff that couldn't wait. You know how it is." But I didn't know how it was, because normal work calls don't involve live chat feeds with hundreds of participants. I started paying closer attention to Ryan's behavior, and I noticed he'd occasionally pause mid-sentence, like he was reading something, before continuing our conversation in a slightly different direction. When our waiter came to take our dessert order, Ryan suggested we share something, then specifically recommended a chocolate lava cake that I'd never mentioned liking. When I said I actually preferred fruit-based desserts, Ryan seemed momentarily flustered before recovering and agreeing to order the berry tart I suggested instead. That's when I realized Ryan might not have been making his menu suggestions based on my preferences at all. He might have been taking direction from someone else. The thought made my skin crawl, but I couldn't figure out how to confirm my suspicions without seeming paranoid or accusatory. My opportunity came when Ryan excused himself again, this time claiming he needed to take that work call he'd been expecting. He left his phone on the table face down, but I could hear a faint buzzing sound coming from it that suggested notifications were still coming through. After debating with myself for about 30 seconds, I carefully turned the phone over to see what was causing the constant alerts. What I saw made my blood run cold. Ryan's phone was running a live streaming app, and our entire date was being broadcast to an audience of over 3,000 viewers. The chat feed was filled with comments about my appearance, my personality, even speculation about my personal life based on things I'd shared thinking I was having a private conversation. But the comments weren't just observational, they were directive. Viewers were suggesting questions for Ryan to ask me, voting on whether he should order wine or stick to water, even betting on whether I'd agree to a second date. I scrolled through the chat history and realized that Ryan had been taking cues from his audience throughout the entire evening. The most disturbing discovery was a pinned message from the streamer, Ryan himself, that read, "Testing new dating content format. Audience gets to direct the date in real time. Let's see how far we can push this before she notices." I felt sick as I realized I'd been turned into unwilling entertainment for thousands of strangers who were analyzing every word I said, every facial expression I made, every bite of food I took. My personal stories, my opinions, my vulnerabilities, everything I'd shared thinking I was getting to know someone new had actually been performed for an audience that was treating me like a character in their twisted reality show. I quickly took screenshots of the streaming interface and chat feed, then put the phone back exactly where Ryan had left it. When he returned from his fake phone call, I forced myself to continue acting normal while I figured out how to handle this violation of my privacy and dignity. "Sorry about that," Ryan said, settling back into his seat. "Work emergency finally resolved." Where were we? I wanted to confront him immediately, to demand an explanation for why he'd turned our date into a live performance without my consent. But I also realized that if I revealed I'd discovered his deception, he might try to delete the evidence or spin the situation to make me look like the unreasonable one. Instead, I played along for the rest of the evening while documenting everything I could remember about his behavior, the timing of his phone checks, and the specific moments when his conversation had seemed to shift based on external input. When Ryan suggested we continue the evening at a nearby bar, I made an excuse about having an early morning and said I needed to head home. As we stood outside the restaurant saying goodbye, Ryan asked if I'd like to see him again, and I could see him glancing at his phone while he waited for my answer. I realized his audience was probably voting on whether to push for a second date, and my response would become part of their entertainment regardless of what I said. "I'll think about it and let you know," I said, keeping my tone neutral while internally seething about being treated like a puppet in his online performance. Ryan seemed disappointed by my non-committal response, probably because it wasn't the dramatic conclusion his viewers were hoping for. He hugged me goodbye and said he'd had a wonderful time, and I could see him checking his phone again before I'd even reached the corner. As soon as I got home, I started researching everything I could find about non-consensual live streaming and what legal options might be available to me. What I discovered was a disturbing trend of content creators using dating apps to find unwitting participants for their streams, turning real people's romantic lives into entertainment without consent. I also found Ryan's streaming channel and discovered that our date hadn't been his first experiment with this format. He'd been live streaming dates for months, always with women he'd met through dating apps who had no idea they were being broadcast to his audience. The comments on his previous streams were filled with analysis of his performances and ratings of the women he'd deceived. The next morning, I called the police to report what had happened. The detective I spoke with was familiar with non-consensual streaming cases and explained that what Ryan had done was illegal under both privacy and consent laws. They were particularly interested in the evidence I'd gathered and the fact that Ryan had been monetizing these streams through viewer donations and subscriptions. The investigation revealed that Ryan's dating stream operation was more extensive than I'd initially realized. He'd created multiple dating app profiles to maximize his supply of potential victims, and he'd developed a regular schedule of streaming dates that had built him a significant online following. He was earning thousands of dollars per month from viewers who paid to watch him manipulate unsuspecting women. Ryan was ultimately charged with multiple crimes including violation of privacy, fraud, and harassment. Several other women came forward to report similar experiences after news of his arrest became public. The streaming platform that had hosted his content also faced scrutiny for not having adequate safeguards against non-consensual broadcasting. But the legal consequences didn't undo the violation of having my most personal moments broadcast to strangers without my knowledge or consent. I had to deal with the psychological impact of learning that people had been analyzing and commenting on my appearance, personality, and life story as if I were a fictional character created for their entertainment. The experience also made me realize how vulnerable we all are to this kind of exploitation in the digital age. Dating apps and social media have made it easier than ever for predators to find victims and turn their lives into content, often without the victims ever knowing they're being exploited. It's been over a year since that horrifying fake date, and I'm still working through the trust issues and paranoia that come with knowing someone can turn your most vulnerable moments into entertainment for strangers. I've become hypervigilant about protecting my privacy and checking for signs that I might be being recorded or broadcast without my knowledge. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that if something feels performative about a date, if your companion seems to be playing to an invisible audience, checking their phone frequently, or steering the conversation in ways that feel artificial, trust your instincts and investigate further. The person I was before Ryan's live-streaming deception was open and trusting, willing to be vulnerable with new people in hopes of making genuine connections. The person I am now is more guarded and suspicious, but also more aware of how technology can be weaponized against unsuspecting victims. Your privacy and dignity are not content for someone else's entertainment, and you have the right to know if your personal moments are being broadcast to strangers. If you suspect you're being recorded or streamed without consent, document everything and contact law enforcement immediately. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem most normal and charming on the surface, using that facade to gain access to victims who become unwilling performers in their twisted online shows. I never thought accepting a drink from someone I'd been talking to for hours would lead to waking up in a stranger's apartment with no memory of how I got there. But that's exactly what happened when I trusted the wrong person during what seemed like the most normal, pleasant first date I'd had in months. What I thought was an evening of genuine connection turned out to be a carefully orchestrated plan to incapacitate me for the production of content I never consented to create. The whole nightmare started when I matched with someone named Chris on a dating app that was supposed to cater to professionals looking for serious relationships. His profile checked all the right boxes: good job in finance, well-educated, photos that suggested he had an active social life without seeming like a party animal. After weeks of matching with guys who seemed more interested in hookups than actual dating, Chris felt like exactly what I'd been looking for. Our initial conversations were refreshingly mature and substantive. Chris asked thoughtful questions about my career as a physical therapist, shared interesting stories about his work, and seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me as a person rather than just trying to get me into bed. When he suggested we meet for drinks at an upscale wine bar downtown, I was optimistic that I'd finally found someone worth my time. The wine bar Chris chose was perfect for a first date: sophisticated but not pretentious, busy enough to feel safe but quiet enough for actual conversation. When I arrived, Chris was already seated at a corner table and he looked exactly like his photos. He stood up to greet me with a warm smile and helped me with my coat in a way that felt genuinely gentlemanly rather than performative. Our conversation over drinks flowed naturally from the start. Chris was well-read and articulate, with opinions on everything from current events to travel destinations that made for engaging discussion. He asked about my work with patients recovering from injuries, and seemed impressed by the education and training required for my profession. For the first time in months, I felt like I was talking to someone who saw me as an equal rather than just a potential conquest. About 2 hours into our date, Chris suggested we order another round of drinks. I'd been nursing my first glass of wine carefully. I always tried to stay alert and aware on first dates, but I was enjoying our conversation enough that a second drink seemed reasonable. Chris ordered for both of us, selecting a wine he said he thought I'd love based on my preferences from our earlier conversation. The second glass of wine tasted slightly different from the first, with a bitter aftertaste that I attributed to it being a different variety than what I'd been drinking. Chris seemed very interested in making sure I finished it, constantly refilling my glass and encouraging me to try more. "This is supposed to be one of their best bottles," he said, topping off my glass again. "You should really experience the full flavor profile." Within about 20 minutes of finishing the second glass, I started feeling much more intoxicated than I should have been from 2 drinks over the course of several hours. My vision began to feel slightly blurry, my coordination seemed off, and I was having trouble following our conversation even though Chris was speaking at his normal pace. When I mentioned feeling unusually tired, Chris suggested that maybe I needed some fresh air. "My apartment is just a few blocks away," he said, signaling for the check. "Why don't you come up for some water and coffee? You can rest for a bit until you feel better, then I'll call you a cab home." In my increasingly foggy state, this seemed like a reasonable suggestion. I trusted Chris. We'd been having such a great conversation and he seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. I didn't question why I was feeling so disoriented from such a small amount of alcohol, or why Chris seemed completely unaffected despite drinking the same wine. The next thing I remember is waking up in an unfamiliar bedroom with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I was still wearing my dress, but it had been repositioned in ways that suggested it had been removed and put back on. My hair was disheveled, my makeup was smeared, and I felt groggy and disoriented in a way that had nothing to do with being hungover. I could hear voices coming from another room, Chris talking to someone else in hushed tones that became quiet the moment I stirred. When I tried to sit up, the room spun violently, and I realized I was still under the influence of whatever had been put in my drink the night before. Chris appeared in the doorway a moment later, fully dressed and acting like nothing unusual had happened. "You're finally awake," he said with a smile that now seemed predatory rather than charming. "You were really out of it last night. I was worried about you." I tried to piece together what had happened after leaving the wine bar, but my memory was completely blank from the time we'd left the restaurant until I woke up in his bed. When I asked Chris what had happened, he gave me a vague story about how I'd suddenly become very drunk and affectionate, practically throwing myself at him the moment we got to his apartment. "You don't remember?" he asked with what seemed like genuine surprise. "You were all over me. Kept saying how attracted you were to me, how you'd been thinking about this all evening. I have to say, I was a little shocked by how forward you were being. But I knew that wasn't true. I'd never been the type to become sexually aggressive when drunk, and I'd only had 2 glasses of wine over several hours." Something about Chris's explanation didn't add up, especially given how disoriented and foggy I still felt hours later. When I insisted that I needed to go home immediately, Chris seemed reluctant to let me leave. He kept suggesting I should stay and rest more, that I might still be too impaired to travel safely. But every instinct I had was screaming that I needed to get away from him as quickly as possible. I called an Uber from his apartment and left despite Chris's protests that I should stay longer. During the ride home, I tried to piece together what had happened, but the gaps in my memory were too complete. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out exactly what Chris had done to me or why. It wasn't until several weeks later that I discovered the horrifying truth about what had happened during those missing hours. I was scrolling through social media when a friend sent me a link to a website she'd stumbled across, saying she thought she'd seen someone who looked like me in one of the videos. What I found was my worst nightmare: professional quality footage of me in various states of undress, clearly incapacitated and unaware of what was happening, while someone off-camera directed the action. The videos were time-stamped from the night of my date with Chris, and they showed exactly what had happened during the hours I couldn't remember. The website was a subscription service specializing in what they called amateur reality content, and my videos were among dozens featuring women who were clearly too impaired to consent to being filmed. The comments section was filled with users discussing which videos were their favorites and requesting specific acts or scenarios for future content. I felt sick as I realized that Chris hadn't just drugged and assaulted me. He'd turned my violation into a product that was being sold to strangers online. My most vulnerable moments had been monetized for the entertainment of people who didn't care that I'd been unable to consent to any of it. I immediately contacted the police and provided them with all the evidence I'd found. The detective who took my case was familiar with similar operations and explained that what Chris was running was part of a larger network of people who used dating apps to find victims for non-consensual pornography production. The investigation revealed that Chris had been operating this scheme for over 2 years, targeting women through various dating platforms and always following the same pattern: charming conversation, upscale location to establish trust, drugged drinks, and professional filming equipment in his apartment designed to capture content while victims were incapacitated. What made the case particularly disturbing was the level of planning and organization involved. Chris kept detailed records of his victims, including their personal information, photos from their dating profiles, and notes about their personalities and vulnerabilities. He'd even created fake social media accounts to monitor his victims after their encounters, making sure they weren't becoming suspicious or reporting his activities. The subscription website where my videos had been hosted was part of a larger criminal enterprise that connected content producers like Chris with paying customers who specifically sought out non-consensual material. The site's operators knew exactly what they were facilitating, and they developed sophisticated systems for protecting the identities of both producers and consumers while maximizing profit from the exploitation of victims. Chris was ultimately arrested and charged with multiple felonies including sexual assault, drug facilitation, production and distribution of non-consensual pornography, and human trafficking. The investigation led to the shutdown of the entire website network and the arrest of dozens of other people involved in similar operations across the country. But the legal consequences couldn't undo the violation of having my assault filmed and sold to strangers, or the knowledge that those videos might still be circulating on other platforms despite the official site being shut down. The psychological impact of learning that my trauma had been monetized for entertainment was almost as devastating as the original assault itself. I had to undergo extensive therapy to process not just the assault, but also the additional trauma of discovering that it had been filmed and distributed to paying customers. The knowledge that strangers had watched and commented on my violation while I was completely unaware it was happening created a sense of ongoing exposure and vulnerability that was difficult to overcome. It's been almost 2 years since that horrific fake date and I'm still dealing with the aftermath. I've had to completely change how I approach dating, always meeting people in public places I choose myself, never accepting drinks I haven't watched being made, and being hypervigilant about any signs that someone might be trying to incapacitate me. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that the dangers of dating apps go far beyond just meeting someone who turns out to be incompatible or unpleasant. There are predators who use these platforms specifically to find victims for serious crimes, and they can be incredibly sophisticated in their approach to gaining trust and creating opportunities to harm people. The person I was before Chris drugged and exploited me was trusting and optimistic about meeting new people. The person I am now is more cautious and vigilant, but also determined to help other potential victims recognize the warning signs of predators who use dating platforms as hunting grounds. If you ever feel unusually intoxicated from a small amount of alcohol, if someone is overly insistent that you finish your drink, or if you have gaps in your memory after a date, seek medical attention immediately and consider that you may have been drugged. Trust your instincts about people who seem too good to be true, and never let anyone pressure you into going to a private location before you're completely comfortable with them. Your safety is more important than being polite or giving someone the benefit of the doubt. And predators like Chris count on their victims' desire to be trusting and accommodating to create opportunities for exploitation. I never thought I'd find myself staring across a dinner table at the person who'd been holding my sister captive for 3 years, but that's exactly what happened when I agreed to meet someone who seemed like the perfect gentleman on a dating app. What started as an evening of promising conversation turned into the most terrifying night of my life when I realized the man sitting across from me had secrets that could destroy my family forever. The whole nightmare began when I matched with someone named Michael on an upscale dating platform that catered to professionals. His profile was impressive: successful businessman, well-traveled, articulate in his messages, and genuinely seemed interested in finding a meaningful relationship rather than just a hookup. After months of disappointing dates with men who seemed more interested in themselves than getting to know me, Michael felt refreshingly mature and stable. Our conversations over the app were substantive and engaging. Michael asked thoughtful questions about my work as a social worker, shared interesting perspectives on current events, and seemed to have a genuine curiosity about the world. When he suggested dinner at an elegant restaurant downtown, I was genuinely excited about the possibility of finally meeting someone who might be relationship material. Michael looked exactly like his photos when I arrived at the restaurant. Tall, distinguished, with silver-touched hair and the kind of confident bearing that suggested success without arrogance. He was already seated at our table when I arrived, and he stood up to greet me with a warm smile and a brief, appropriate hug that made me feel instantly comfortable. The conversation over dinner flowed naturally. Michael was well-read and articulate, with stories about his travels and business ventures that painted him as someone who'd lived an interesting life. He asked insightful questions about my work with at-risk families and seemed genuinely impressed by my dedication to helping vulnerable people. For the first time in months, I felt like I was having dinner with someone who saw me as an equal partner in conversation. But about halfway through our meal, Michael mentioned something that made my blood run cold. While discussing his work in property management, he casually mentioned owning several rental properties in rural areas outside the city, including what he described as a really secluded place that's perfect for people who want complete privacy and isolation from the outside world. The way he described this property, emphasizing the isolation, the lack of neighbors, the fact that someone could live there without anyone knowing they existed, reminded me immediately of my sister Emma, who had disappeared 3 years earlier without a trace. Emma had been 22 when she vanished after her shift at a coffee shop, leaving behind no evidence of where she'd gone or what had happened to her. "That sounds very remote," I said, trying to keep my voice casual while my heart started racing. "What kind of tenants are you looking for in a place like that?" Michael's expression shifted slightly, and for just a moment, I saw something calculating behind his eyes before his charming smile returned. "Oh, people who value their privacy above everything else. Sometimes individuals need to disappear from their old lives for various reasons. Debt problems, family issues, legal troubles. I provide a service for people who need to start completely fresh." The way he said disappear from their old lives made my skin crawl. I thought about Emma constantly, how she'd simply vanished without any explanation, how the police investigation had turned up no leads, how our family had spent 3 years wondering if she was alive or dead. The possibility that she might be trapped in some isolated property owned by the man sitting across from me was almost too horrifying to consider. I tried to continue eating and making normal conversation, but my mind was racing with questions about Michael's properties and what kind of privacy he might be providing to people who needed to disappear. When he excused himself to take a phone call, I quickly searched his name on my phone and found several news articles about missing persons cases in areas where he owned property. What I discovered made me feel sick. Over the past 5 years, at least 6 women had gone missing from locations within 50 miles of Michael's various rental properties. The disappearances had all followed similar patterns. Young women vanishing without a trace, leaving behind no evidence of where they'd gone or who might have taken them. When Michael returned from his phone call, I noticed he seemed slightly agitated, checking his watch and glancing toward the exit as if he was eager to leave. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to gauge his mood and figure out if my suspicions might be justified. "Just some property management issues," he said, but his tone had changed from the relaxed charm he'd displayed earlier. "One of my more difficult tenants is having some problems adjusting to the isolation. Sometimes people think they want complete privacy until they actually experience it." The way he said, "problems adjusting to the isolation," sent chills down my spine. I thought about Emma, outgoing, social Emma who loved being around people and would never have chosen to live in complete isolation. If Michael was keeping her or other women against their will, he might describe their attempts to escape or communicate with the outside world as problems adjusting. I knew I needed to get more information without making Michael suspicious that I was onto him. "That must be challenging," I said. "How do you handle tenants who aren't happy with the living arrangements?" Michael's smile took on a darker quality. "Well, when someone signs a lease for that level of privacy, they're essentially agreeing to certain restrictions on their freedom. No unauthorized visitors, no communication with outsiders without permission, complete compliance with house rules. If they can't handle those conditions, there are consequences." My hands were shaking as I realized Michael might be describing a captivity situation rather than a rental arrangement. The lease he mentioned could be code for kidnapping, and the house rules might be the conditions he imposed on his victims. I needed to find out if Emma was being held at one of his properties, but I also needed to be extremely careful not to alert him to my suspicions. "It sounds like you've created a very controlled environment," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Have you had any tenants who've been with you for several years?" Michael's eyes lit up with what looked like pride. "Oh yes, I have one young woman who's been with me for about 3 years now. When she first arrived, she was very resistant to the lifestyle change, always trying to contact people from her old life. But over time, she's learned to appreciate the peace and security that complete isolation provides." My heart was pounding so hard I was sure Michael could hear it. A young woman who'd been held for 3 years, who had initially tried to contact people from her old life. It had to be Emma. I needed to get more information, but I also realized I might be in serious danger. If Michael was responsible for Emma's disappearance and potentially other abductions, I could become his next victim. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and immediately called 911 from my phone. I whispered to the dispatcher that I was on a date with someone I believed might be connected to my sister's disappearance and potentially other missing persons cases. I provided Michael's name and the restaurant location, asking them to send officers but to be discreet because I was afraid he might flee or become violent if he realized I was on to him. When I returned to the table, Michael seemed to be studying me more carefully, as if he was trying to determine whether I suspected anything. "You seem a little distracted," he said. "Is everything all right?" "I'm fine," I lied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just tired from a long day at work." Michael nodded, but I could see him evaluating my responses and body language in a way that made me feel like prey being assessed by a predator. "Well, perhaps we should call it an evening then," he said. "But I'd love to see you again soon. Maybe next time I could show you one of my properties, the secluded one I mentioned. I think you'd find it very educational." The invitation felt like a threat disguised as a romantic gesture. I forced myself to smile and say I'd think about it, while internally screaming at the thought of being taken to wherever he might be holding Emma and other victims. As we waited for the check, Michael's phone rang, and I could hear a panicked male voice on the other end saying something about a situation at the property, and needing Michael to handle the problem immediately. Michael's expression darkened as he listened to the call, and I realized this might be my only chance to gather more information. "Is everything okay?" I asked. "You seem upset." Michael ended the call and looked at me with an expression that had lost all pretense of charm. "One of my long-term tenants is having a behavioral episode," he said coldly. "She's been trying to attract attention from some hikers who got too close to the property. I need to go remind her of the consequences of breaking our agreement." I felt sick as I realized he might be talking about Emma trying to signal for help, and that my presence here might have somehow triggered increased security measures at whatever location she was being held. I needed the police to arrive before Michael left to handle the problem with his captive. Just as Michael was standing up to leave, police officers entered the restaurant and approached our table. Michael's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, anger, and finally a cold calculation as he realized he'd been exposed. "Michael Patterson," one of the officers said. "We need to speak with you about some missing persons cases in your area." What happened next was chaos. Michael tried to run, knocking over chairs and pushing past other diners as he headed for the restaurant's back exit. The officers pursued him while I sat at our abandoned table, shaking and trying to process what I'd just experienced. Michael was arrested that night, and a search of his properties led to the discovery of 4 women being held captive in specially modified basements and outbuildings. Emma was among them, alive but traumatized after 3 years of imprisonment. The other women had been missing for various lengths of time, with the longest captivity lasting almost 5 years. The investigation revealed that Michael had been using dating apps and other online platforms to study potential victims, gathering information about their families, social connections, and daily routines before orchestrating their abductions. He'd created an elaborate system for keeping his victims isolated and dependent, breaking down their resistance through psychological manipulation and threats against their families. My accidental date with Emma's kidnapper led to the rescue of 4 women and the exposure of a criminal operation that had been destroying families for years. But it also left me with the trauma of knowing how close I'd come to becoming another victim, and how easily I'd been drawn in by someone who was skilled at presenting himself as a perfect gentleman. It's been over a year since that horrific evening, and Emma is slowly recovering from her ordeal with the help of intensive therapy and family support. The experience taught both of us that predators can be incredibly sophisticated in their approach to finding and manipulating victims. I'm sharing this story because I want people to understand that the dangers of online dating can extend far beyond disappointment or incompatibility. There are individuals who use these platforms specifically to study and target victims for serious crimes, and they can be masterful at presenting themselves as exactly what their targets are looking for. The person I was before that fake date was trusting and optimistic about meeting new people online. The person I am now is more vigilant about protecting myself and others from predators who use romantic connections as a cover for their criminal activities. Trust your instincts if someone seems too interested in isolation, privacy, or taking you to remote locations. Ask specific questions about their lifestyle and pay attention to how they respond. And remember that your safety is always more important than being polite or giving someone the benefit of the doubt. Sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who study their victims carefully enough to become exactly what those victims think they're looking for. I never thought accepting an invitation to someone's business party would lead to discovering I was being recruited for a human trafficking ring, but that's exactly what happened when I trusted someone who'd spent weeks crafting the perfect persona to lure me into a situation where I'd be completely vulnerable and isolated from anyone who could help me escape. The whole nightmare began when I matched with someone named Adrian on a dating app that marketed itself to young professionals. His profile was polished and impressive, successful entrepreneur, well-dressed in his photos, articulate about his business ventures and international travels. After months of matching with guys who seemed immature or directionless, Adrian appeared to be exactly the kind of ambitious, successful man I thought I wanted to date. Our initial conversations were sophisticated and engaging. Adrian asked thoughtful questions about my career goals as a recent college graduate, shared stories about building his import-export business from the ground up, and seemed genuinely interested in my aspirations for the future. He presented himself as someone who could offer mentorship and opportunities to someone just starting their professional journey. What impressed me most about Adrian was how he seemed to understand the challenges facing young women in competitive career fields. He talked about wanting to help other ambitious people achieve their goals, and he mentioned having connections throughout various industries that could benefit someone with my qualifications and work ethic. When Adrian suggested we meet for dinner at an upscale restaurant, I was excited about the possibility of connecting with someone who might become both a romantic partner and a valuable professional contact. He chose an elegant place downtown that suggested he had sophisticated tastes and the financial means to afford the best. Adrian looked exactly like his photos when I arrived at the restaurant. Tall, impeccably dressed, with the kind of confident presence that commanded attention without seeming arrogant. He was already seated at a prime table, and he stood up to greet me with a warm smile and a brief kiss on the cheek that felt appropriately intimate for a first date. The conversation over dinner was everything I'd hoped it would be. Adrian was well-traveled and knowledgeable about business, with stories about successful ventures in various countries that painted him as someone who knew how to identify and capitalize on opportunities. He seemed genuinely interested in my background and career aspirations, asking detailed questions about my education, skills, and what kind of work environment I was hoping to find. About halfway through dinner, Adrian mentioned that he was hosting a networking event the following weekend, a party at his penthouse where young professionals could meet potential employers, investors, and mentors in a relaxed social setting. He described it as an opportunity for ambitious people to make connections that could transform their careers. "I think you'd be perfect for this crowd," he said, refilling my wine glass. "Smart, articulate, ambitious. Exactly the kind of person who thrives when given the right opportunities. Plus, I have several contacts who are always looking for talented people to join their international operations." The invitation sounded like exactly the kind of opportunity I'd been hoping to find since graduating. Adrian described an environment where I could meet successful business leaders in a casual setting, potentially leading to job offers or partnerships that could jumpstart my career in ways that traditional job searching never could. When I expressed interest but mentioned I'd want to bring a friend for safety reasons, Adrian's demeanor shifted slightly. He explained that the event was exclusive and invitation only, with strict security protocols that prevented guests from bringing unauthorized companions. He assured me that safety wouldn't be an issue since the party would be held in his own penthouse with professional security staff. "I understand your caution," he said, reaching across the table to touch my hand. "But this is exactly the kind of opportunity that requires taking calculated risks. The most successful people are the ones who are willing to step outside their comfort zones when the right chance presents itself." Something about the way he emphasized calculated risks and dismissed my safety concerns made me uncomfortable, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or ungrateful for what appeared to be a genuine opportunity to advance my career. Adrian seemed successful and well-connected, and he'd been nothing but respectful during our entire conversation. As dinner continued, Adrian provided more details about his business operations that gradually made me more uneasy. He talked about helping young people relocate for better opportunities, often to international locations where they could earn more money than they'd ever imagined possible. He mentioned that some of these opportunities required people to be flexible about their living arrangements and communication with family during initial training periods. "The international market is very different from what most Americans expect," he explained. Success often requires adapting to new cultural norms and being willing to limit distractions from your old life while you focus completely on building your new career. The way Adrian described these international opportunities, emphasizing isolation from family, adaptation to unfamiliar cultural norms, and complete focus on work, reminded me of stories I'd heard about human trafficking operations that used legitimate-seeming business opportunities to recruit victims. When I asked for more specific details about what these international positions entailed, Adrian became vague and evasive. He said that the specifics would be explained at his networking party, where I could meet other young people who had successfully transitioned to these lucrative overseas positions. It's the kind of opportunity that's difficult to explain in abstract terms, he said. You really need to see it in action, meet people who've succeeded in these roles, before you can fully appreciate what's being offered. I started paying closer attention to Adrian's body language and word choices, and I noticed he kept steering the conversation away from specific details about his business operations while emphasizing the financial benefits and lifestyle improvements that came with working in his network. When I mentioned that I'd want to research any opportunities thoroughly before making commitments, Adrian's expression darkened slightly before he recovered his charming smile. Of course, due diligence is important, he said. But these opportunities move quickly in today's global market. People who spend too much time researching and consulting with others often miss out to candidates who are ready to act decisively. The pressure to make quick decisions without thorough research was another red flag that reminded me of tactics used by traffickers to prevent potential victims from seeking advice or conducting background checks that might reveal the true nature of what they were being recruited for. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and immediately started Googling Adrian's business name and details he'd mentioned about his import-export operations. What I found made my blood run cold: several news articles about investigations into suspected human trafficking networks that used fake business opportunities to recruit young women for forced labor and sexual exploitation. The articles described operations that followed exactly the pattern Adrian had outlined: sophisticated recruitment through dating apps and professional networking, promises of lucrative international opportunities, exclusive parties where victims were isolated from their support systems, and gradual coercion into situations where escape became impossible. When I returned to the table, I tried to act normal while internally planning how to extract myself from the situation safely. Adrian seemed to be studying my face more carefully, as if he was trying to determine whether I'd become suspicious during my absence. You seem a little distracted, he said. Second thoughts about the networking opportunity? I forced myself to smile and said I was just tired from a long day at work, but I could see Adrian evaluating my responses in a way that made me feel like he was calculating whether I was still a viable target or if I'd become too much of a risk. As we waited for the check, Adrian's phone rang, and I could overhear parts of a conversation about the weekend delivery and making sure the new girls understand the rules before they meet the clients. When he ended the call, he seemed agitated and eager to leave. I need to handle some business issues, he said, signaling aggressively for our waiter. But I hope you'll seriously consider the party this weekend. Opportunities like this don't come around often, and I'd hate for you to miss out because of unnecessary anxiety. The way he framed my legitimate safety concerns as unnecessary anxiety and continued pressuring me to attend his party despite my obvious discomfort confirmed my suspicions that this wasn't a legitimate business opportunity. I made non-committal responses about considering his invitation while internally planning to go straight home and report everything to the police. As we stood up to leave, Adrian placed his hand on my lower back in a way that felt possessive rather than romantic, and he walked me to the street while continuing to pressure me about attending his party. I'll be very disappointed if you don't show up, he said as we reached the corner where I planned to catch a taxi. I've invested a lot of time in identifying you as someone with real potential, and it would be a shame to waste that investment. The way he talked about investing time in identifying me and not wanting to waste that investment made it clear that I wasn't a potential romantic partner or legitimate business contact. I was a target he'd been grooming for recruitment into whatever operation he was really running. I got into the first taxi I could find and went straight to the police station, where I provided them with everything I could remember about Adrian's business claims, his networking party invitation, and the details I'd overheard during his phone call. The detective who took my statement was familiar with similar cases and said they'd been tracking several suspected trafficking operations that used exactly the tactics Adrian had employed. The investigation that followed led to the shutdown of a major human trafficking network that had been operating across multiple states. Adrian and several associates were arrested, and dozens of victims were rescued from various locations where they'd been held after being recruited through fake business opportunities and social events. Many of the victims had stories similar to mine. They'd been approached through dating apps or professional networking platforms by people who seemed successful and legitimate, offered opportunities that seemed too good to pass up, and gradually coerced into situations where they lost control over their lives and movements. The networking party Adrian had invited me to was actually a recruitment event where potential victims would be drugged, photographed in compromising positions, and then blackmailed into compliance with trafficking demands. The international opportunities he described were forced labor and sexual exploitation operations in countries where victims would have no legal protections or ability to escape. It's been over a year since that terrifying fake date, and I'm still processing how close I came to becoming a victim of human trafficking. The experience taught me that predators can be incredibly sophisticated in their approach to recruitment, using legitimate-seeming business opportunities and romantic connections to identify and groom potential victims. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that human trafficking doesn't just happen to people from disadvantaged backgrounds. It can target anyone who might be vulnerable to promises of career advancement, financial opportunities, or romantic connections. The person I was before that dinner with Adrian was ambitious and optimistic about building my career, willing to take risks that might lead to greater opportunities. The person I am now is more cautious about networking opportunities that seem too good to be true and more aware of how traffickers exploit young people's professional aspirations. Trust your instincts if someone pressures you to make quick decisions about opportunities that would isolate you from your support system. Legitimate business opportunities don't require you to cut contact with family and friends or relocate without thorough research and planning. Your safety is always more important than any career opportunity, no matter how lucrative or prestigious it might seem. If someone becomes upset or dismissive when you want to research opportunities or bring trusted friends for support, that's a red flag that should make you reconsider their intentions entirely. I never thought accepting a dinner invitation from someone I'd been messaging for weeks would lead to waking up on an operating table with my abdomen partially opened and a man in scrubs explaining which of my organs would fetch the highest prices on the black market. But that's exactly what happened when I trusted the wrong person during what seemed like the most romantic, thoughtful first date I'd ever experienced. The whole nightmare started when I matched with someone named Dr. Samuel Chin on an upscale dating app that catered to educated professionals. His profile was impressive: successful surgeon, well-traveled, sophisticated interests in art and classical music. After months of disappointing dates with men who seemed more interested in hookups than meaningful connections, Samuel felt like exactly the kind of mature, accomplished partner I'd been hoping to find. Our conversations over several weeks were intellectually stimulating and emotionally engaging. Samuel shared fascinating stories about his work in reconstructive surgery, his volunteer medical missions to developing countries, and his passion for helping people improve their quality of life through advanced medical procedures. He seemed genuinely interested in my work as a research coordinator at a medical device company, asking thoughtful questions about my projects and career aspirations. What impressed me most about Samuel was his apparent altruism and dedication to helping others. He talked about the satisfaction he derived from giving people second chances at healthy, productive lives through surgical interventions. He mentioned his involvement with organ donation programs and his belief that modern medicine had a moral obligation to make life-saving treatments accessible to everyone, regardless of their financial resources. When Samuel suggested dinner at an exclusive restaurant known for its farm-to-table cuisine, I was excited about finally meeting someone who shared my interests in both intellectual conversation and fine dining. He chose a place that was sophisticated without being pretentious, and he made reservations for early evening so we'd have plenty of time to talk without feeling rushed. Samuel looked exactly like his photos when I arrived at the restaurant: distinguished, well-groomed, with the kind of confident bearing that suggested both professional success and genuine warmth. He was already seated at a secluded corner table, and he stood up to greet me with a charming smile and a brief, appropriate embrace that made me feel instantly comfortable. The conversation over dinner was everything I'd hoped it would be. Samuel was articulate and knowledgeable about a wide range of topics, from current medical research to international humanitarian efforts. He asked insightful questions about my background and seemed genuinely interested in my perspectives on healthcare ethics and medical innovation. About halfway through our meal, Samuel began discussing his work with patients who needed organ transplants. He talked about the tragic shortage of available organs and his frustration with the lengthy waiting lists that prevented deserving people from getting the treatments they desperately needed. "The current system is so inefficient," he said, cutting into his expertly prepared salmon. "There are healthy, compatible organs going to waste while people die waiting for transplants that could save their lives. If we could find more efficient ways to match donors with recipients, we could save thousands of lives every year." I found his passion for helping transplant patients admirable, though something about the way he discussed organ allocation seemed slightly clinical and detached from the human elements of these medical decisions. When I mentioned that organ donation was a complex ethical issue that required careful consideration of donor consent and family wishes, Samuel's expression shifted slightly. "Of course consent is important," he said, but his tone suggested he viewed these ethical considerations as obstacles rather than essential protections. "But sometimes the greater good requires us to think beyond individual preferences. When someone has organs that could save multiple lives, isn't there a moral argument for ensuring those organs reach the people who need them most?" The way Samuel framed organ donation as a utilitarian calculation rather than a personal medical decision made me uncomfortable, but I told myself he was probably just passionate about his work and frustrated by the limitations of the current system. As dinner continued, Samuel suggested we continue our conversation at his place, describing it as a penthouse apartment with an amazing view of the city skyline. He mentioned having some rare wine he'd been saving for a special occasion, and he seemed genuinely interested in extending our evening together. "I have some medical journals I think you'd find fascinating," he said, signaling for the check. "Articles about cutting-edge transplant procedures that are revolutionizing how we think about organ matching and surgical outcomes." The invitation seemed reasonable. We'd been having such engaging conversation about medical topics that looking at professional literature together felt like a natural extension of our dinner discussion. Samuel had been nothing but respectful and intellectually stimulating throughout the evening. His apartment was indeed impressive, modern, elegantly furnished, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular views of the city. But what caught my attention immediately was how sterile and clinical the space felt. The furniture was beautiful but impersonal, and there were medical textbooks and anatomical charts displayed in ways that made the living space feel more like a doctor's office than a home. Samuel poured 2 glasses of an expensive-looking red wine and suggested we sit on his leather sofa to look through some recent medical publications. The wine had an unusual aftertaste that I attributed to it being a variety I'd never tried before, but Samuel encouraged me to finish the glass, saying it would help me appreciate the complex flavor profile. Within about 15 minutes of finishing the wine, I started feeling unusually drowsy and disoriented. My vision began to blur slightly, and I was having difficulty following our conversation even though Samuel was speaking at his normal pace. When I mentioned feeling tired, Samuel suggested I should lie down on his sofa to rest for a few minutes. "It's probably just the wine combined with a long day," he said, helping me recline on the sofa. "Just close your eyes and relax. I'll make sure you get home safely once you're feeling better." The next thing I remember is waking up in what appeared to be a medical facility, strapped to an operating table with bright surgical lights overhead. I was conscious but unable to move, and I could feel that my abdomen had been opened and medical instruments were being used inside my body cavity. Samuel was standing over me wearing surgical scrubs and gloves, along with 2 other people I didn't recognize. They were discussing my organs in technical medical terminology, evaluating their quality and condition for potential harvest and transplantation. "Her kidneys are in excellent condition," Samuel was saying to one of his associates. "Both should fetch premium prices, especially given her age and health status. The liver looks perfect too. No signs of damage from alcohol or drug use." I tried to scream or move, but I realized I'd been given some kind of paralytic drug that kept me conscious but prevented me from speaking or moving. I could hear and understand everything happening around me, but I was completely helpless to stop what they were doing to my body. "The heart is particularly valuable," the other person responded, examining something I couldn't see. "We already have a buyer lined up, private client willing to pay triple the usual rate for a healthy young heart from someone with this blood type?" Samuel nodded and continued his examination of my internal organs. "We'll harvest the kidneys first, then the liver, and finally the heart. The corneas and other tissues can be processed afterward. This should be one of our most profitable procedures." The casual way they discussed dismantling my body for profit while I was still alive and aware was more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. I realized Samuel wasn't a legitimate surgeon helping patients. He was running an organ harvesting operation that killed healthy people to sell their organs to wealthy buyers who didn't want to wait for legal transplants. I don't know how long I lay on that table listening to them plan my murder, but eventually I heard commotion coming from elsewhere in the building, shouting voices and what sounded like police radio communications. Samuel and his associates stopped their preparations and looked toward the door with obvious concern. "We need to finish this quickly," one of them said. "If they're here for us, we need to complete the harvest and dispose of the evidence before they get through the security doors." But it was too late. The door to the operating room burst open and police officers rushed in with weapons drawn, followed by paramedics who immediately began working to stabilize my condition and reverse the effects of whatever drugs I'd been given. Samuel and his associates were arrested on the spot, and I was rushed to a legitimate hospital where surgeons spent hours repairing the damage they'd done to my abdominal cavity. I was incredibly lucky that the police had arrived before they'd removed any major organs. Apparently, one of Samuel's previous victims had managed to escape and provide information that led to the investigation of his operation. The investigation revealed that Samuel wasn't a real doctor at all. He was a former medical student who'd been expelled for unethical conduct and had been running an illegal organ harvesting operation for over 2 years. He used dating apps to identify healthy, isolated victims who could be lured to his facility and killed for their organs. His fake apartment had been designed specifically to seem impressive and trustworthy, while his actual operation was conducted in a converted warehouse equipped with stolen medical equipment. He'd been selling organs to wealthy clients around the world who were willing to pay enormous sums to avoid waiting for legal transplants. The wine he'd served me had been laced with a cocktail of sedatives and paralytic agents designed to incapacitate victims while keeping them conscious during the harvesting process. Samuel apparently enjoyed having his victims aware of what was happening to them. It was part of the psychological satisfaction he derived from the crimes. I was the 7th victim Samuel had targeted, but the first to survive the initial stages of the harvesting process. The other 6 victims had been completely dismantled for their organs, with their remains disposed of in ways that made identification nearly impossible. It's been over 6 months since that horrific fake date, and I'm still dealing with both the physical and psychological aftermath of nearly being murdered for my organs. I've had multiple surgeries to repair the internal damage, and I'll be in therapy for years working through the trauma of being conscious while someone planned to dismember me for profit. I'm sharing my story because I want people to understand that organ trafficking is a real and growing criminal enterprise that targets healthy people through sophisticated deception and manipulation. If someone seems unusually interested in your health status, medical history, or physical condition, especially early in a relationship, pay attention to that red flag. The person I was before that dinner with Samuel was trusting and optimistic about meeting accomplished professionals through dating apps. The person I am now is hyper-aware of how criminals can exploit medical credentials and humanitarian rhetoric to gain access to victims for unthinkable crimes. Trust your instincts if something feels wrong about a date's behavior or location, even if they seem professionally successful and intellectually engaging. Your life is literally more valuable than being polite or giving someone the benefit of the doubt when warning signs suggest they might have malicious intentions. The most dangerous predators are often the ones who seem most legitimate and trustworthy on the surface, using their apparent respectability to gain access to victims who would never willingly put themselves in danger.